I do want to start off with the Treasury Department and some of the sanctions that we heard from earlier this week out of the Treasury and whether the moves that the Treasury Department has made right now are enough.
Look, I think they're taking constructive and appropriate steps. I think they've done more damage to the Russian economy more quickly than most people would have expected. You've got pervasive bank run type phenomena going on in Russia. So they're delivering a real jolt to the Russian economy, and they're delivering a real jolt especially to those close to President Putin. What that's going to mean for the orders President Putin is giving is anyone's guess. That we would see the kind of attacks on nuclear power plants risking a Chernobyl-style meltdown that we've seen over the last 24 hours is shocking. And I don't think anybody can be certain what is in President Putin's mind, and that makes this such a dangerous situation. But I think we have to be proud of the way the United States has been able to mobilize an alliance across Europe, indeed an alliance across the world, to respond to this situation more quickly and more vigorously and with more unity than almost anyone would have expected.
And that's the response now coming out of the U.S. Of course, this does make the job a little bit harder for Jerome Powell and the policymakers at the Federal Reserve. We heard from Jerome Powell this week on Capitol Hill. He did basically say that they're keeping an eye on the situation in Ukraine, but at least in his words, he doesn't think that that's going to derail the playbook that the Fed has already laid out. Do you anticipate that?
Look, I'm not going to speak for the Federal Reserve. I think the Fed had a very hard problem because it was behind the curve on inflation beforehand. And now this major adverse supply shock in the form of higher oil, higher commodity prices generally, which, by the way, should not be blamed on what we are doing. It should be blamed on what President Putin is doing. That's going to make the task of engineering a soft landing that much more difficult for the American economy. So I think the employment risks and the inflation risks are very grave right now, and it's going to be a very delicate task of policy to try to contain inflation while maintaining stable economic growth. It's possible that the Fed will be able to pull it off, but there are very substantial risks on both sides, on the inflation side and on the cyclical downturn side.
Well, I guess that's the question, though. When you look at the additional inflationary pressures that have basically been added to the equation over the last couple of weeks here, is monetary policy an effective tool to tamp that down?
Monetary policy is an effective tool, but it may not be an effective tool without engineering a slowdown in the economy. The last dot plot has the Fed believing that three things are going to happen together: that inflation's going to fall below 3, unemployment's going to stay well below 4, and interest rates are never going to go above 2.5. I don't think those things are all likely to happen together, and so the Fed's going to have to make some very difficult choices. I think that there's much more danger that we're going to do too little to contain inflation than there is danger that we're going to do too much. I think we're now facing real risks of a 1970s type scenario. Not quite as high levels of inflation as we saw in the 1970s, but the same kind of broad phenomena of stagflation. And that is in part a response to the very bad break we've gotten from the geopolitics and what's happening with oil and commodities. but it's also a response to the excessive stimulation of the economy during 2021.
Well, how do you compare when you look at the economy today and you look at, I guess, some of the strength that we're seeing there, whether it's in consumer spending? We had an employment report out earlier this morning that showed a significant jump in growth in jobs, as well as, of course, a drop in the unemployment rate here. At least by those measures, this is still a pretty strong economy. And I'm wondering, how does that compare to where we were in the 70s when that stagflation hit? Was the economy sort of moving at the same pace that we're moving now?
Economy was strong coming out of the 1975 recession, and combination of supply shocks and overheating led to a very serious inflation situation. The key variable that I'm watching in the U.S. economy right now is tightness in the labor market. And what I'm seeing is vacancies at record levels, quits at record levels. I think we've got a labor market that historically would have corresponded to 2% unemployment. And the labor market is getting tighter, not easier. And so that tells me we're likely to see acceleration, not deceleration, in wage inflation. And since labor is by far the biggest cost factor in the economy, ultimately that's got to show through to prices. And that's why I think we've got a very complicated problem of policy management.
What breaks that cycle? What breaks it down?
Yeah, it's possible that we'll get some breaks on commodities, that some of the places where there have been bottlenecks, we'll see bottleneck easing, that inflation will come down, that nobody's really expecting a ratcheting up of inflation. And so with low inflation expectations and with a decline in bottleneck inflation, the situation will solve itself with modest action by the Fed and the passage of time. That kind of soft landing certainly is possible. It's not what I expect, but I don't preclude the possibility. I think in policymaking, what you need to do is hope for the best and plan for the worst. And so I think we need to be recognizing the real possibility that without a significant slowdown in the U.S. economy, we're likely to have inflation be unanchored 2 years from now. And so the Fed is likely to have to make very, very difficult choices.
What do you think about the communication from the president himself coming out of that State of the Union address? Do you think he made that case?
I think the president was very powerful on the Ukraine issue, and I think ultimately that is the issue of this moment. I think President Biden needs to make a transition that is in some ways similar to the one that President Roosevelt made. At some point, Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "I'm no longer Dr. New Deal. Now I'm Dr. Win the War." And I think that President Biden is going to have to make a transition from being President middle class to being President preserve democracy. And that's going to be a very fundamental transition that the administration needs to make. I think that process started in the State of the Union, but it's got a ways to go.